Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for making it to this session. From threatened democracies to authoritarianism across the world, we face a lot of problems, journalists specifically. So from getting permission, journalists getting killed, or just the narrative, how it's built in the global north and the global south. So today we want to discuss some of these issues, threats to journalism, journalists, and we have Rajesh Prabhakar. He's one of the fixers from India who works out of Asia's largest slum, Dharavi, and he's worked with New York Times, BBC. Then we have Ms. Hani, and we have Mr. Avinash, who runs a startup in India. So, yeah, would you want to start? Yeah, so my first question would be about the problem with narrative when it comes to global north and south. How do you pitch stories, how it is portrayed? Ms. Hani, if you would want to talk about that.
I'm not sure, can I be heard? Yeah. Oh, good. So in terms of the narrative, it's, I think this is, as someone who sort of has reported for foreign, Western, sort of US-based and also Germany-based papers, I feel like there's a certain narrative that's expected, and I mean, in a sense, editors are also excited about like sort of underreported stories, about sort of an idea that you have that they haven't read about in other sort of papers, or if they haven't heard about it at all, they're very excited. But once they see the finished product, I feel like when it doesn't match their narrative, it sort of becomes a sort of point of conflict where they're like, oh, so you're writing about theater in Karachi, but where's the Taliban, for example? And you're like, oh, there is no Taliban because it's just a play, and there's some music in it, and like they're borrowing from Bach, and like and there's all these influences, and there's no Taliban, unfortunately. And then they're like, oh, so can we pay you a kill fee, and like can we not run the story? And so this has happened a few times to me. Where they're like, oh, this is great, yeah, talk about the literature festival, and then they're like, but what are the philosophical questions that the intelligentsia is facing in Pakistan right now? Like, what are their threats? Well, how are they feeling? And I'm like, it was just a literature festival, really. Like, I mean, the food was good. There was like food on the side, and but that's not a narrative that sells, and so. That's a huge conflict. I think that's, and everything seems to be, sort of framed in a certain sort of context. So either, there's the unusualness of, or something that's like sort of unexpected for a foreign audience, as it were. That kind of that's kind of the framework that happens. Like I remember 5 years ago I reported on the elections in Pakistan. That was in 2013, and in the end when so I went to sleep. It was a stressful day. It was very hot, 35 degrees. And the next morning I woke up to a headline with my byline that said, "Women come out to vote in the first elections in Pakistan." And I was just, I'm 35 years old. I was 30 then. Women had been coming out to vote for the last 30 years, as far as I saw it with my own eyes. So that wasn't a headline. It wasn't like women were coming out for the first time. But it's just that everything needs to be framed in that narrative for it to be sort of like sold in a pretty package to audiences in the US or Europe or the UK, and that's I think something that needs to be, that's a question that needs to be dealt with, as it were.
Okay. So guys, just wanted to ask a question to you. What do you think are the problems journalists worldwide are facing? Because I know the topics such as Global South, but I just want to like maybe make a list of issues that we are facing globally. Maybe fake news or threats or anything. So anyone has any points before we go to the next points? Okay. Okay. Rise of ultranationalism. I mean, it's a big problem in South Asia right now. So, yeah. Anything else? I mean, in probably Europe, US, anything else? Political leaders, fake news, or
diversity in the newsrooms,
yeah, lack of diversity. Yeah. So, does anyone have any questions to anyone? Because this panel is very South Asia centric right now. So I just want more people, if they want to talk, then you have any opinions to add on, then you're more than welcome to join in. So besides the narrative problem, you spoke about fragmentation of media, India having so many languages, and local news not making it to the national press, forget international press. So what do you have to talk about that?
I'll just come to a point that my friend said from there, the whole counter-nationalism thing and propaganda. It is a growing concern, and what I feel personally of my experience is that we are so diverse as a region that just 5 minutes back I was talking to Hana and I said maybe Urdu is the first language of Pakistan, and she corrected me saying, sorry, it's just spoken by 8% of Pakistanis, and there are other languages just like we have in India. So until unless a story is coming out of the metros of India or the English-speaking audience, it is just not hitting the international agenda. And leave aside the international agenda, the big problem is that people who report on world's largest democracy, which has got at least 30 languages which are officially verified, don't make it to their own newsrooms. We fight different battles. We slipped 3 ranks in Freedom of Press Index last year. 13 journalists lost their lives, but none of that is covered. If anybody is to open any Indian website today, all they would hear is about a very heinous crime of a rape of an 8-year-old child in Kashmir. But that, if you were to read it, that has happened 2 months back. It has taken 2 months for the so-called mainstream to rise up to it. Maybe there might be a bias or something that they want to bring into. So I believe the biggest problem that I could talk about the South Asian region is that we don't make it to our own newsroom, leave aside the world outside. So language is one barrier, and then the narratives are set. So if I am writing, let's say, against the regime, whichever it might be it at the state level or the national level, I'm a branded international. Something which we would hear about our neighbors across the border, that this happens, but now it's an Indian phenomena. Now, if you are moving a little bit here or there, you are under a radar. If you report on Naxalism, if you report about loss of GDP or the government policies or something which is not good with our economy, there is a straight line, go across to the border and settle in Pakistan. So ironically, that is something which is plaguing and is discouraging many people to write. And we are so much under the control of the government. Like just 4 days back, before I took a flight to Italy, the latest issue was the government asking the ministry to look into the accreditation of journalists, that if a case is registered against a journalist saying that what you reported was not right, they might lose out on their accreditation. Now, this hasn't happened in my country for the last 70 plus years, but now that is being considered. So when they got a backlash, they said, all right, we'll not do this, but we will monitor everything which is online. Everything which is blog would be looked. So there's a big move to censor news, censor online news and independent voice, which is very scary. So any which ways, because of the diversity, the stories were not coming out, and then the whole threat of censorship makes it equally more difficult to, do any sort of journalistic work.
So, as someone from across the border that Avinash mentioned, I actually began my career in 2006 at a news magazine based in Karachi. I was reporting on the streets. We were in the throes of our, 5th military dictatorship, and we actually had a lot of freedom at that point. And even now, I feel, and I don't report for sort of Pakistani, I identify more as a former reporter than as a current reporter, because I work on longer form stuff now, so I'm not regularly in the news, and I haven't written for Pakistani news in a very long time. But from what I know of the landscape, I feel like that kind of deep censorship is also a new thing. It's maybe about 5 years old. And having said that, of course, there's more nuance to that. And if you're writing in English, you escape with, you get away with murder, essentially. But You don't if you write in a sort of, in a language that, in Urdu, for example, which, more people can read. So I, would just like to add nuance to that as well. I think sort of the kind of intense sort of degrees of censorship are also new in Pakistan, because ironically we did enjoy a lot of press freedom. At least the English press enjoyed a lot of press freedom during the time of Musharraf. So just wanted to add that.
Okay. One more point I would like to make is intersection of religion and politics. This has been happening a lot in South Asia. For example, when Avinash mentioned about this 8-year-old little girl's rape and murder, it happened early in January, 23rd, 24th January. I remember writing about it for Global Voices, a blogging platform. Back then, a lot of Indian newspapers did not report it. It was in, like, say, 3rd page, 4th page, there was just a small blurb, but nobody wanted to talk about it. So why did they not want to talk about it? Because Kashmir is a conflict zone, highly like, the presence of military is like at least 10 armed soldiers to 1 civilian. And then there's the problem of pellet guns, people getting killed. 8,000 Kashmiri men have disappeared over the last 10 years. And this war has been raging for a long time. So do you think journalists, when they have to report in such conflict zones, they will have the courage to, because their families are threatened, they are put on different lists and stuff like that? So, I mean, honestly, it's a shame that an 8-year-old girl who was brutalized, gang raped by men, and it makes it to the national press now, after like 3 months. What kind of democracies do we live in? I mean, the largest democracy in the world. So that's one point I wanted to make. And like, taking it to you now, since you worked as a fixer, you worked with so many international organizations, what are the challenges do you face, specifically with legal representation in case you do some stories and then the government comes to you, security agencies come to you?
So most of the time I work with international news crew. So I am based in Bombay, the place called Dharavi. It is one of the largest slum in the world. So most of the people who are traveling or want to do documentaries or films, definitely they would like to come to Dharavi to do a story. So I'm kind of fixer coordinator for the field coordinator for them. So we are not given the proper script, what exactly they want to do, like what exactly the story is. So according to the story, whatever they give it to us, we do it to find a character, to find a location, to whatever it is. We find the story to them, but end of the part, the end of the story, the final cut through, we don't get to see that thing. After months also asking for them, it is, we don't get to see them actually.
Avinash, so you were talking about unreported stories and alternate formats, like how do we go about either finding these platforms, or else what's the best way to go about doing journalism locally in India? Could you speak about that?
Yeah, I would. That I've traveled in the last 1 year extensively. I figured out one thing is very encouraging, which is happening in India and which should happen elsewhere, is that small groups are forming local communities and they are reporting big stories. And they are coming with such amazing things that that surprises you. Like there is a small little part of India which is on the northeast and mostly on conflict. And till about 1.5 years back, till I traveled there for the first time, I had no clue it exists or what are the issues. But I met a bunch of 4 boys who report a blog, and they were blocked by the last regime. When the Congress was in power, they blocked them because they were writing a lot on the local riots that were happening because of the tribal conflict. When I dwelled a little more, I figured out there are 4 individuals. One is a coder, he's a technocrat. One is a cyclist, one is a photographer, and one does some marketing work. They're all settled in 4 different parts of India. Only 2 people are there in Northeast, but they are so well connected and that they report truth and they are not dependent for their own salaries on journalism, that they have the highest number of stories. Now, if anything is to be broken in that part of the world, it comes first on their blogs. That happens as one case. Similarly, I met somebody on the western side in Punjab. He writes in absolute Punjabi, but he is the #1 source. But their limitations are their languages and that there are no takers for them in the mainstream. But if anything is happening, they are the first ones who are coming out. Similarly, there is a gentleman working in the largest state, Uttar Pradesh. He's got something amazingly working on WhatsApp. He has got people to pay for his WhatsApp news. So some 850,000 Indian rupees he earns every year when he just reports, if I was to talk of this context, that if somebody sets up a news network in Perugia and says, I will give local news of Perugia, which is important to people here, can you pay me, let's say, 10 euros a year? So he works on a similar model in India and raises a great amount of money and does some path-breaking stories which would never come out. So such experiments are happening in pockets, but they are happening in languages. It's heartening to see that companies like Google, because they need now the next big hits coming out from Indian languages, are supporting such endeavors. So for me, I'm very hopeful that local reporting, people forming independent groups and reporting with a cause will get people's support. As a panelist yesterday said that if you are truthful over a period of time, you will generate trust and that will translate into transaction. That's a big strategy for big houses, but it is happening at individual levels, which is very heartening. And I would love to see these attempts multiply so that we can get those stories which would never make it to the day otherwise. So I think those are positive steps and they need to be backed up. Okay. If they are backing, look at India, the big scams that have come out or the big crime stories that have been broken have been all because of these small people in smaller pockets.
Okay. So someone mentioned censorship here. So I just wanted to get this from Pakistan. How rampant is censorship or self-censorship? I mean, just
so I sort of can't speak personally because I'm a culture reporter, so I don't get censored very much except, you know, I just get reframed, which is one form of censorship, I suppose. But from what I understand, there is a lot of journalists do practice self-censorship because there's certain topics that are just kind of off the table. And so, I mean, yes, it's definitely an issue. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, the issues seem to be, I mean, not seem to be there, censorship, threats to journalists, like in 2016, 79 journalists were killed, which was still a 17% fall from what happened in the previous years. But do you have any sort of questions? Could we make it a two-way engaging thing? If any of you have any questions, then, yeah.
Gentleman over there.
Yeah.
I think he's been asking. Yeah, he's been transferred. Hi.
Yeah, it does work. Yeah, a question that I think is really pertinent with what you've just said. So obviously, I think it was November of last year, the BBC World Service expanded its language section to include various different languages. And I think Punjabi is a new one that they've included, and
Gujarati.
and Tigrinya, where obviously in Eritrea, huge problems with press freedom. And I guess I'd be interested to hear your reflections on that, because you emphasize that supporting local journalism is a really important thing, but then obviously the BBC has an element of protection as an outsider as well. So yeah, any reflections would be great. Thank you.
See, it's nice that you brought that up and that you've been following it. This is the second attempt that BBC has taken to get into languages. If I could be very right, they started it somewhere around 2012. They tested the market, they went back. But, and BBC has a wonderfully interesting model. It's a public service broadcaster in Britain, but elsewhere, you know, you need pounds to fuel the beast. So my understanding, which is purely my understanding, and that I've been following it for a long time, is that all these languages are now generating a lot of traction in India, and a lot of digital revenue and clicks come in. So it makes a lot of business sense for the BBC from a market like India, where the ad spend is high, the readership is growing, the internet penetration is going. So, and even if you look at the stories, you know, I would not say that they follow the same guidelines that they follow it for BBC Britain. So it's all over the place. At times there are headlines which are absolutely clickbait. So for BBC to venture into India, I understand it's a way to get into a market where they can tap into advertising and they could get just that out. Because I'm yet to see a story which is like what they do on their BBC London page. So far, nothing of that sort has come across. But I think these are early days. This is their second attempt, and as they grow in size. But one good thing that they have done out of all this is that few language journalists have got some very good breaks into the BBC. So at least, you know, looking at the fraternity point of it, language journalists are getting some space where they could go in and maybe put out their work. But very early days for BBC to be tested in India.
Thank you for bringing up this point about language, regional languages and BBC. I had a chance to discuss the same issue with some of my acquaintances at BBC Tamil. And as far as I know, BBC Tamil is around for many years, many decades.
Okay.
And it's not in defense of BBC, but just what I observed.
Okay.
So
that way, BBC has been around in some few languages as well.
Exactly. So in those languages, I think the reporting is going on well at the regional level. I don't know about other languages. I consume BBC News in 3 languages: English, Tamil, and Hindi. And
Hindi has been around for long.
Yeah, exactly. And also other news outlets or regional news outlets. So I follow in at least 4 languages: English, Tamil, Hindi, and Malayalam.
Okay.
So regional reporting in all these different states mean different things within BBC and outside BBC. Absolutely. So it's a big question for a big discussion in itself, which
Absolutely
is out
agreeable.
of the scope of
No, it's out of
yeah.
scope of this work, but just because the question came in, I replied. But I have seen, I followed it in Gujarati extensively and a bit in Punjabi. The way they have revamped, and some of my friends and colleagues have joined in there. So still early days, and it used to be there in 32 languages around. So I'm pretty sure Tamil was always a great market. There are a lot of Tamilians across there in London. So that way the diaspora, the connect, lot many things happen, but the kind of work in the news sites is yet to be tested.
Right. Having said that, my point, BBC Tamil is putting a lot of weightage on this classical narrative of Sri Lankan Tamil genocide and so on. So that is one point I would agree if anyone is raising that. But within India, I think all the points that the panel has risen is valid. But my point regarding regional reporting within India is, for example, Kerala. There are progressive magazines and newspapers in that state compared to other states. Maybe we could compare West Bengal, but still Kerala dominates in coming up with progressive publications. Still there are threats to journalists. But in case of Tamil or Hindi or Telugu or any other regional languages, there is a domination of certain news networks, and you know which ones I'm talking about. News 18, for example. So we
Let's
we
not
know.
talk about News 18. That's a different ball game altogether now.
So yeah, why I'm bringing these points up is because yes, some of the points we discussed there you discussed are really important, but it is this kind of corporations and what drives journalism in South Asian countries like India, Pakistan, and also other countries. So it would be great to hear those points.
I'll just touch upon the 2 states that you have just mentioned, Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Well, Tamil Nadu, I've been so many times, I've never been able to figure out. But Kerala, for the larger audience, I would say it's the only state in the country which has got 100% literacy. The background is completely different, and they are in a different regime. And Network 18. Another big problem is that all these regions are dominated by different regional politics and things, and a regional network for their daily bread and butter and survival is dependent a lot on regional government advertising. So there you go. So the moment you put out something around, your ads fall down. I'll just take the example of my state. One of the oldest publication lost out on a revenue, I can't translate it, in tunes of 60 crores. You know, if I can do it in millions, it would be around 600 million local currency. Huge advertising losses because they were against the government. So for how long can you sustain that battle? 18 months down the line, they gave up. That doesn't work, and not at the regional level. In India, most of the English-speaking portals are struggling with the subscription model. There is only one successful model in the entire country. And that because they are a very small startup and they deal with only 5 sectors. So subscription in the South Asian context is a difficult ball game. People don't even subscribe for a newspaper completely. You know, that is a different challenge. And you're thinking, we are a freebie culture. Everything has to be free, and what is news, you know? So.
Can I just add, sort of observing this conversation, I'm also wondering how, I mean, how do we bring that local reporting that's in Tamil or in Sindhi or in Punjabi? How do we bring stories like Kashmir to the Italian audience or the Austrian audience or the, you know, I mean, so like, you know, in terms of like sort of bridging cultures and, you know, like Vishal just talked about, you know, Kashmir, that's a huge issue. It just never gets reported in the international press or almost never gets reported. And so how do we sort of, you know, how do we sort of like take this further outside of South Asia and ensure that, you know, more things than just, you know, Modi's choice of kurta pajama or, you know, like, or gets reported in Western media so that, you know, so, because, I mean, the reporting in sort of European and American media is also creating certain stereotypes. It's the reason why we're asked certain, you know, we as South Asians who travel to the West are asked certain questions because the news media frames a certain narrative around South Asian countries that are extremely limited, as we know. How do we sort of bridge that? And that's a really interesting question to me, and you know, sort of sitting here in the festival. So, yeah.
I think, you know, for that angle, I would say, you know, it's heartening to see a friend of ours from Dawn reporting here, or I don't know if he report. We need to get, while we have our people coming in and report on fests here, maybe on a Karachi fest or a Jaipur Lit fest, we need to invite people from here and say, listen, our cultures are beyond. Now, if somebody talks about nightlife in Pakistan, you know, people would not believe it in the first go.
That's true.
You know, so maybe we need some state-sponsored junkets or derivatives where people from the West can come in and look at our lives. Listen, we are normal people. There's not a bomb happening every other way. I can tell you from Rome to Perugia, I changed 2 trains, and on every different train, you know, we are identified very easily, and the first question is, hello, listen, is it safe to travel to India? You know, can I travel here? Would I get this? Listen, you know, people travel, big MNCs have set up offices, and if nothing else, your embassy people live hale and hearty there. So it's just normal, and that whole narrative, until unless we have this exchange where people could come in freely and have a look at the Karachi Lit Fest, maybe.
Sure.
We would not be able to bridge that entire gap.
Actually, interestingly, so you know, while I was sort of talking about the Karachi Literature Festival, I tried to report on it for a German paper last year, and it was just too normal for the editor. So I think sort of foreign editors do need to like sort of expand their minds.
I think they need to travel.
Yeah.
You know, they should have somebody other than you, maybe, to come in and say, listen, you know, your plane lands here, and when you land, you go through the security check and are not abducted.
I just had a question at that point. You say journalists should travel, but when it comes to regions like, say, Kashmir, or a lot of things were happening in Maldives, and the government doesn't let you travel to those places. So what do you do in those cases if we want to take the conversation also a bit political?
Fair enough. You can't maybe reach Kashmir, but you could always come to New Delhi.
But then New Delhi is not
Listen,
Kashmir.
land here, and as they always say that once you land in and you figure your way around. But you can't just simply say that you're not invited in. You can't reach here, but you could reach to the next best destination. Technology enables you to find a connect. Maybe you could find somebody like Rajesh in Kashmir, and there you get with your Skype. You do your reportage in a different way. When Arab Spring was happening, I remember I was in London, and Guardian had a completely different strategy. They did not know Arabic. So they opened it up for people. And if there was something which was going wrong, people would set it right. And that's how they developed their entire page and library of Arabic. So I agree, you might not be allowed to reach Kashmir, but you could reach Jammu. You could reach Delhi and maybe then look around. Form a narrative. Listen, you can't go into one zone, but you could be till outside and still look for it. It's your job as a journalist to do that.
Again, I would highlight one point. A lot of journalists who go to either Jammu or Kashmir,
Listen,
French, no, they get deported. I just wanted to
I'll tell you, nothing against foreign journalists who are here. I've met a lot of them in Delhi. Most of the bureaus are there. And ironically, they look for India in posh locales of South Delhi or of South Bombay. Sorry to say, they don't travel themselves. So somewhere that whole complicacy of setting up sets in and the ease of doing business. Like I've bumped into a number of foreign correspondents at a Taj hotel or a Diplomat or XYZ places, but you seldom see them in, let's say, North Delhi. Have you seen your Bombay reporters who report on Bombay, maybe one or two, when they land, they go to South Bombay or BSE or maybe a Dharavi because that's a set narrative. Beyond that, there is India. Or beyond that, there is a Pakistan or there is a Sri Lanka. So somewhere that, again, it boils down to the narrative, what sells, how many clicks.
Yeah. Ultimately,
how many
agree with
clicks?
you. I mean, ultimately, I don't.
Everybody is in India clicking a story where an Indian tennis player who has married a Pakistani cricketer has made a statement. And the biggest news is not what the people have said about an incident, but do you have a right to talk as an Indian yet, or do you have a right as a Pakistani talk about it? So what are we getting caught into? I think the biggest thing is to break those narratives, and those narratives can only and only be broken if the communities are strong. If there are people who are exchanging their thoughts and views on communities, there is no two-way that story would not come out. Yeah.
A couple of freedom of press issues were already mentioned, both in Pakistan and less so in India. So
I'm glad to hear less in India.
Well, less was mentioned, so I don't know if actually fewer.
We take your point.
So I was wondering what sort of strategies newsroom adapt to still do good journalism despite pressure from the government or elsewhere.
You'd like to go first?
I don't, and again, I don't have first-hand experience. I just, have an observer's view of the landscape in Pakistan as someone who lives there. I think that there is no resistance. I think that the media houses are very corporatized, and this has been happening for the last 35 odd years, that they don't succumb to pressure from the governments at all. They quite give in to pressures from the governments, and this has been happening since the 80s because most of the media houses are run by rich business people, and it's in their self-interest to be sort of hand in hand with the government, with the sort of established viewpoint. There's it's big business. It's not creating information.
I'll bring the Indian context into it, and like she mentioned, I'll continue to add to it that the big media houses in India, sadly, are not only into the business of journalism. Journalism forms a very small pie of their bigger pies. So, they are very vulnerable. I can only think of one big media house, which is the Bennett and Coleman, which is not directly involved in any other business. They have other strategic layers. They work the loopholes around. So, it becomes very easy for the government of the day to, buckle them under pressure. Just open a file in any other different case and we have got you. We have had a mysterious story about a media owner being asked by the Prime Minister that your editor needs to go. It has happened here. And so it is coming here. It's becoming very, very evident. In smaller regions, like he took an example of Network 18. That is run by a guy who handles the oil and gas, which is directly under the government of India. So if you report against the establishment of the day, it is very easy for us to hamper your other business and interests. So the censorship is coming to us, but in an indirect way. The government say, we have never stopped you, but the owner would say, listen, we don't want to get in. Vice India, a US enterprise which has been trying to get into India hasn't been able to take off. And if I'm not wrong, they've changed nothing less than 3 editors, even before taking off. Because in the initial stage, one guy wrote a story and the management said, listen, we can't run a story like this, because I don't want the ruling party's president to come in and ring me up, even before I've taken off. So that is one threat that we have to deal with. And the way out is how many independent people, how many small pockets can come in and say, listen, we have devised our own. And heartening to see Indian people supporting some websites like The Wire, which has been taking a stand against the government. They have been slapped with a legal case, but people have donated funds for them. Another website I know which is completely ad-free and they critique media and government are again public funded. So it is happening in smaller pockets. If there's a gentleman who runs a fake news busting site who is busting fake news every day that the government propaganda machine is coming out, and there are people who donate him from something as simple as 100 rupees to a higher amount. So the only way is how you gather trust from people and how you get them to pay for yourself.
If I can just sort of nuance that a little bit further, the very few independent media houses, or I wouldn't call them media houses, publications that are still alive, do engage in a lot of self-censorship because, I mean, they wouldn't be allowed to be otherwise. So I think that they pick their battles, and I think, for example, my sort of former employers, Newsline, they do the best they can, and that's why they're still around, suffering very much financially, but they're still around. So
even on the issue of accreditation, that when the government even tossed that whole idea that we will look at the accreditation system, surprisingly enough, it was journalists, individuals who raised that voice and not the media houses.
Yeah, true.
So you are out there to fight your own battles. And we have come up with a very interesting case. In the last 2 years, you have had lots of corporates and related agencies filing suits against journalists. I have a friend who has been fighting a liable case by an airline, which is 1,000 crores. So hell of a money, How can a journalist even fight that? But that is just not to fight it. That is to intimidate others and say, listen, don't come out with this.
The next...
There is a question there.
I have 2 points to mention. You talked about Kashmir by reporters having no access. So Hindustan Times did a documentary on Burhan Wani in 2016. It was very well done. They went into the valley. They talked to his family, his friends, the people he grew up with. So there wasn't any restriction on their access there. They were pretty easily allowed to go there and report on it. Also, somebody talked about censorship. So it will remain an issue in developing countries because you can say that with rampant corruption and poor law and order situation and courts taking ages to decide on cases, So there will always be censorship. I mean, look at the UK, for example, two big media houses in Pakistan fought a case in the UK court, and it got settled in a matter of a few weeks, or let's say months. But in Pakistan, we don't see that. Cases linger on for so while that you have no hope for quick or swift justice. So, I mean, how can we combat censorship in such a scenario when you have no security or no laws there to protect journalists? Nobody signs up to get killed. Of course, if there's threat to my life, I will, of course, observe censorship.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So the reporter who was reporting for Hindustan Times, who did this documentary, and then even after that, he's been trying to report from Kashmir, and sometimes the problems he faces is distrust in media. A lot of Kashmiris don't trust mainland Indians because obviously there's a change in narrative, the way Indians look at Kashmir problem as it's our land. And Kashmiris say, we want plebiscite, we want independence, why don't you listen to us? We don't want to be either on this side or this side, just listen to us, and whatever the UN had said after 1947, 1950, you listen to that. So obviously a lot of journalists are self-censoring. Today I was talking to one of my Kashmiri journalist friends, and I asked him if he could make a small video, talk about the problems you face on ground, because whatever happens in Shopian, like, civilians getting killed in crossfire, militants versus security forces and stuff, and he's worried for his family. He's like, no, I will not come on video, because I've been asked specifically not to report or blog or anything, because mostly his line whenever he reports is about plebiscite, that, Kashmir should get the plebiscite out. Like, people should be allowed to decide for themselves the future that they want. So, I mean, people are self-censoring themselves now. Most of the Kashmiri journalists are moving out to Turkey, working for TRT World or somewhere else. I mean, you know a couple of them. So, like, local Kashmiris, when they work with Indian publications and all, they have to be very careful on, like, what is their stand, what is the locus standi, or, what is the opinion. So, it's, at the end of the day, it's self-censorship, because you have to survive in the industry, you have to survive in the media, and then look for ways to become stronger and report these stories eventually.
So hello again. I have a comment here following up to Ani's point. So how could we bring regional or state level news from South Asia, different South Asian countries to the world? So I'm a science journalist, so I write about science, technology, environment and health, public health and so on. So in my specialism, I don't see this as a big problem, both for me as a journalist, Indian journalist working from abroad, or foreign correspondents working from India. So there are several publications where development stories and public health stories and energy stories, energy transition and clean energy, all these things, they are getting reported also from the regional level. The Thomson Reuters Foundation, for example, they have their Trust News website. They publish stories on trafficking in women and climate and so on, also in 1 or 2 different regional languages in India. The same for other scientific aspects, like there is a website called SciDevNet. They focus on science and technology stories from the global south, not only India and Pakistan, but also other countries. So there is DevX on development journalism. So for this sector, development and science and technology and medicine, my observation so far in 6 years in journalism is like it's kind of going okay, although of course there's always room for improvement. But it's interesting to see all of your discussions on political journalism and all such things. So I was wondering if you have thought about this, different journalism sectors. Like now I mentioned science, technology. So do you have any other thoughts on other sectors within journalism?
Yeah, I think culture, for example. Like if you're trying to report on sort of a cultural event in Pakistan or India or anywhere in the global south, I think that it's not considered in the same light as reporting on a classic musical festival in Switzerland. And I have a problem with that, because if we're sort of talking about global culture and we're talking about newsrooms globalizing, and we're talking about like sort of bringing stories from other places to to your specific audience, then I think you need to have a broader mind about it. So if the New York Times can report on the Lutsen Classical Music Festival, why can't it report on the Karachi Literature Festival? And it doesn't. And so there is a polarization of a white Western world versus everywhere else, and that is something I have a problem with. And obviously there's like deeper nuance to that, and I think, I think sort of journalists based in and from countries aside from, and forgive me for making that kind of polarization, like the non-white Western, journalists based in the non-white Western world sort of also frame themselves in a certain way, and I think this cycle is kind of, is creating this otherness, which I have a deep problem with, and I don't see it going away anytime in the future. So even though there is science and development journalism being done, it's framed in a certain way, which I have a problem with, and I continue to have a problem with. So I mean, what Avinash and I were talking about, the BBC will cover the Jaipur Literature Festival, but it's almost like in this, like sort of in these tones of like, you know what? There's a literature festival in India, and I have a problem with that. I have a problem with the surprise that goes with it. I mean, of course, there's a literature festival in India. There's people there. Why wouldn't there be one,
Well, half of the literature festival is British. We have William Dalrymple there, so there goes the story. There are other lit fests which hardly get covered in the BBC. Does Kovalam Lit Fest get covered? You follow BBC now. There's a Kovalam, Kerala Lit Fest, Kovalam. It has never been covered in BBC? No, because...
I wouldn't say never. It depends on any issues arising. For example, with respect to the Jaipur Literature Festival, if Salman Rushdie's entrance is debated, then that's so no, that kind of thing is only being reported.
I'll tell you, leave Jaipur Lit Fest because that is half British.
No, I'm giving an example here.
No, what I'm saying is I'll go with her with non-white people, because Kovalam Lit Fest is run by a fellow former colleague of mine who's a journalist, but that never gets covered in any which way or format. The poor guy, despite being a journalist, struggles for coverage. He's been an author, he has spoken at different places, so there are stereotypes. And why culture? Thomson Reuters, you rightfully said, Thomson Reuters also runs a service for farmers in India which tells the prices of food grains. But I'm very, very surprised, that there's such a huge crisis, and you don't see as many great detailed stories by Thomson Reuters on the distress of Indian farmers, the way our agricultural economy is going. That is all gone. But they would ask that farmer to pay 30 rupees every month for that one SMS every day saying wheat goes at this price or pulses goes at this price. So, where does that come into picture? So a lot of our problems, which are our day-to-day things and which form the 70% of economy of a country, are not being addressed. So there are issues, they will continue.
We just have a video from a Myanmar-based journalist considering the Rohingya issue, reports and all. It's getting so difficult, limiting the space for journalists to report on. So just want to play it quickly, then we can take questions, I guess. So.
What we've seen in the recent years in Asia is a growing set of restrictions on journalists who are trying to get access to people affected by conflicts and trying to get access to conflict areas. And these conflict areas are not war zones, not traditional war zones. These are areas where own governments or own military is taking action against its own citizens, be it Balochistan in Pakistan, or Indian Kashmir in India, or Rakhine State in Myanmar. So if you're trying, as an independent journalist, you're trying to get information from these areas, you're doing so at an enormous risk, and you're putting yourself in danger. And we have seen there are numerous examples when journalists in Asia then tried to bring information from conflict zones, what's happening to them. For example, in Myanmar, two journalists who worked on Reuters investigation into the killing of 10 Rohingya Muslim men in Rakhine State during an army crackdown that began in August 2017. And a court, what's the end result? A court in Yangon has been holding preliminary hearings since January to decide whether these 2 journalists will be charged under the colonial era Official Secret Acts, which carries a maximum penalty of 14 years. And they have done amazing work. They are journalists and they have done their job, and this is what they are facing. And in Pakistan, there's a colleague of ours, Taha Siddiqui. He was doing amazing journalism in his own country, but he was very vocal.
Sorry guys, the audio is not like proper, so maybe we could take the last questions.
Yes, please. From the striped shirt.
Hey, I want to go back to what you said about reporting on culture, because you said it's not reported very well and you don't think it's going to change soon. But if we want to change it, how can it be changed? And would you rather have your own stories being more reported in Western media, or, as you said before, Western journalists should travel more and go more in depth? So should Western journalists step back and let you do the reporting for Western media, or should they just report in a different way?
Thank you for that question. So I think that as a journalist, and I know that this is absolutely impossible because journalists are also human beings, but I think it should be irrelevant whether it's a journalist from Germany or Australia or New Zealand who goes and reports on whatever story. I think it's the way the story is reported and the narrative around it. That's my problem. So, I mean, whether it's myself reporting it or Anna here reporting on the Literature Festival, if the editor is going to sort of frame it as there's a literature festival in Karachi and you know what, there was all this security there, that is my problem with it. I mean, when you sort of stop seeing an event as an event and you see it as a context, you see it within a context of a narrative that you have created, which is security or Talibanization or oppression of women, that is my problem. So, you know, it doesn't matter, I think, the skin color, nationality of the journalist that's reporting it. I think it has to do with the editorial framework. That's actually what I'm trying to get at. So, you know, I mean, I, as a sort of journalist of Pakistani origin and as someone who identifies as Pakistani, I should be allowed to write about the opera in Milan if I want to, but it's not usually the case. So, yeah.
That's it, right? So, any other questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap up for the day. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.